saying is that the most probable scenario is further escalation. Independent now on the actual like battle line, but like also on the economic warfare front, right?
Yeah, I think that.
Right. Yeah. So
yeah, I mean,
go for it, please.
no, I was just going to say, I think the biggest escalations have been taken with that central bank sanction, the sort of, the largest moves, at least from the Western side that we could see. We're seeing the move towards tweaking around, the Dutch have said they're going to push Russia out of LNG markets. The EU is trying to find a way to push Russia out of its supplies there as well. Russia still, and actually increased supplies of liquefied natural gas carried by ship to Europe last year, earning the Russian state a lot of money. Also just yesterday, or sorry, just on Sunday, the G7, came together and said we're going to try to cut Russia out of uranium markets as well. That's another area where the Russians didn't certainly very much push back. So I think the biggest moves have come on the Western side, and it will be about further refining them to effectively try to increase that discount. Russia still has not only more pressure it can use on the agricultural front, I think the gas weapon it can't use anymore, but in particular, there is still very much a risk, and I think that the West should be planning for it, of a sort of repeat of the Arab oil embargo type scenario, where Russia effectively says, we're going to cut oil exports to everybody to try to drive oil prices way up and increase those inflationary and economic pressures on the West again as well. And this is where I think Putin has had one very big success over the last decade, slightly less, but the rise to power in Saudi Arabia of Mohammed bin Salman. In the US, there was sort of this narrative that, Salman is very close with Trump and Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, and that MBS is working on trying to get around his reputation as a pariah for the Khashoggi affair. I think, to be honest, MBS doesn't care, and he thinks that the benefits of the U.S. relationship are in the past and will only continue to fade, and that's been a big factor in his making this OPEC plus relationship with Russia. So I think Russia could only really effectively use that weapon if it has a tighter partnership with Saudi Arabia. There are still tensions there. It seems so long ago now, but it was just 3 years ago, maybe even today, that oil prices went negative in the middle of April 2020, which was the result of a spat between the Russian state and the Saudi state over global oil supplies in that COVID environment, and trying to use it to increase their market share. But that's where I see the big weapon that the Russians could still use to escalate.
Right. So but let's assume we it is more about refining now the weaponry. It's still escalation, right? Because like we obviously refine in order to make it more effective, which kind of brings us then to another player, which is obviously China, where we had recently like interesting meetings happening, interesting kind of announcements. Like, how do you see, apart from the obvious that the Russian state is probably becoming like more and more a vassal state to the Chinese, but like, how do you see this relationship, and how do you see the role of China in this economic warfare?
Certainly. So I'll begin with the caveat that, I've spent the last 15 years of my life studying Russia and Russian policy and the language, and traveling throughout the former Soviet region. And I don't think I have the same understanding of Chinese policy making as I do of Russian policy making. Of course. But my views on China, in part because I look at Russia so much, tend to be much more dovish than what you generally find in the West. Now, we've had this trade war going on, which the United States really launched with China in 2017 under the Trump presidency for 6 years now. It's become bipartisan in the West, and I think that the West often conflates China with Russia, because for China, the enemy of, my enemy is my friend. But when Putin sort of hoped that China would have this friendship without limits, which was the term that both sides used in a bilateral meeting just on the at the beginning of the war, I think that, it's been very clear that it's not really that much of a friendship, but more of a older sibling, younger sibling relationship. And I think there are very clear limits on it. So, if we compare China's reaction to Russia's initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and the annexation of Crimea, and the first sanctions that were imposed with how it is now, in the aftermath of the 2014 invasion, China, within 2 months, signed the initial Power of Siberia deal. Reports are that they got good gas discounts. They opened up new lines of credit to a number of Russian banks, including some of the ones that were targets of the initial sanctions regime. And they really moved to increase trade. Now, in the most recent meeting between Putin and Xi, it's been over a year since Russia invaded Ukraine in its full-scale invasion. Still nothing on China, from China on the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, which Russia really needs now to replace its European exports, not to gain a new export market, but to replace one that itself has, lost through its gas weaponization. Russia needs defensive material support because of how much larger the war is now and how much support Ukraine is getting from the West. And then it needs new loans to replace its lack of access to credit markets and a way of bringing the profits that it has had from increased commodity prices over the last year to being something that it can actually use to buy friends and allies internationally. Putin got none of those things from Xi in his meeting. So, from my view, from looking at it from the standpoint of, how is this good for Russia, I saw it as a total failure. Now, because there was this great pomp and circumstance and Xi was going to go meet, Putin just after he's indicted by the International Criminal Court and everything, the West sort of freaked out and said, oh, this is this, new Russian-Chinese access. And I think that, China has a strategy to replace the United States as the premier geoeconomic power. I think it's, from what I see, a lot of the advice that I would sort of give to the U.S. to protect itself is stuff that I think China is already doing and advancing. So while I don't speak Chinese and have good insights into the internal deliberations within the Chinese Communist Party, from what I see it doing internationally, a lot of that stuff is what I think is quite successful for it to eventually replace the U.S. not only as the key geoeconomic power, but to become the core node of the international economic order. But for now, I actually take the point of view that China sees Russia's actions as more of a threat to its agenda than it does an opportunity to advance them. That may change at some point. It may be that Russia finds enough loopholes around the sanctions that, say, you have a Trump or a Trump-like presidency in the US again that is unwilling to enforce them, that China then is able to use Russia more as a way to try to challenge the existing order. But, while Chinese-Russian trade was up significantly last year, it's really just China buying decreased commodities from Russia, decreased, I mean discounted, ones that sanctions effectively meant Russia has to sell for cheaper internationally or can't sell to the West. Whereas it's, not providing Putin with the technology, defensive material, and loans that he needs to really counter the West's economic strategy and win on the battlefield in Ukraine. So, my view is certainly that China is a lot more hesitant than I think we give it credit for in the West, but at the same time that I worry this U.S. bipartisan anti-China agenda, Europe's sort of wishy-washy position in the middle, unwilling to take sides one way or the other, that we're in an environment that it's actually the West that is pushing China more towards Russia's camp, whereas we should very much be doing the opposite of that. And this is another example where I'm talking about carrots rather than sticks. China doesn't listen to U.S. sanctions, doesn't care about them. We can we could sanction Chinese businesses if they are found to be selling chips to China that use Western technology, to Russia that use Western technology, or if China does or is revealed to be providing some key defensive support. But those won't work. Instead, I think the West should go to China and say, hey, how about in exchange for you Moscow agreeing not to do this to Russia. Of course, you don't have to announce that officially, and just make the visits to Moscow a little less frequent, send the message quietly. But in exchange for you, not doing this, we can lower tariffs on X, Y, or Z. And that seems to be something that there is no genuine discussion of in Washington, or even in the European capitals, where people like Macron are saying, oh, we need to find another position and a way in the middle, because Europe doesn't have the ability to take those kind of actions independently of the United States, I think. But it could at least try to propose them and do so in a more diplomatic manner than Macron sitting on a plane flying back from China as it's about to launch major drills outside Taiwan to a bunch of journalists that he then insists on having the interview edited. I'm talking about the Politico interview that was published earlier this month, which I think has only increased the backlash in the United States. Macron should not be flying to Beijing to have that meeting. He should be flying to the United States and saying, hey, let's reconsider our approach to Beijing because of the level of threat that Russia is now. This doesn't mean you need to love TikTok or whatever, but I think is about picking your battles where they are. So yeah, that's sort of the short term where I think China stands now. It's certainly another question, another point of discussion, where the West and China are headed, and whether their economic war will in the future turn into, go from a trade war into an economic war as the West and Russia have been in.
Which is pretty much like, if you are a Chinese, or if you are Xi Jinping, then you look at this, I would argue, and you see it to a certain extent as a playbook, right? Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, your book is titled, like Economic Lessons Learned, right? So what do you think can China, or what can China learn, like from your perspective? Obviously, there are a lot of kind of scholars writing about it from the Chinese perspective, but what do you think can be, like you as a, even as a Chinese kind of like, corporate now, you're thinking about these kind of scenarios for sure. Like, what do you see? Like, what are the takeaways from everything that we have seen right now between the West and Russia? What should I make out of it if I'm on the Chinese side?
So I think the lessons for China, both in its population and its corporate environment, really come a lot more from the 2014 until 2022 period than they do the post-2022 period, because it's understanding about how both sides have taken action that led to escalation, but then also how the geopolitics of other areas that are not necessarily driven by the United States or Moscow in that case, or Beijing or Washington in the future scenario, how those local developments have then created an environment that has, further the tensions. The two examples we already spoke about, I think, are very relevant to this, with Saudi Arabia and with Turkey. Saudi Arabia plays a very important role in oil supply to China as well. And while the sort of recent moves to, potentially buy some oil in yuan are not as big of a concern as I think some people have made them out to be, for technical reasons we can discuss if you'd like. It's understanding about how both sides essentially egged the conflict on and failed to understand one another, spoke past one another, and other countries took advantage of that for short-term benefits, but that I think have had long-term costs for the entire world. What I would say is a big difference is, a very big difference, I think this point can't be emphasized enough, is that the full-scale economic war between the West and Russia that we've seen since last February is in some ways unimaginable between the United States and China. And I think therefore a lot more focus will be on both sides, and hopefully should be, on how to avoid it. And the simplest way I think you can look at this is mutually assured destruction, right? So in the Cold War, plenty of states, as a result of during the Cold War, plenty of states as a result of Soviet Soviet-Western competition had major conflicts on their borders, including China. You know, there's an argument to be made, China's role in Vietnam, in Korea, and the like were very much shaped by those factors. But nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union was unthinkable. This may have actually led to more conflict on the peripheries. You know, I think, again, another book to recommend, Cold War, Global History by Odd Arne Vestad, whose name I'm probably mispronouncing, but is a professor at the LSE here in London, which really looks at the, you know, global impact of the Cold War in the so-called Third World and elsewhere on the periphery. You know, I think that that really increased conflict there. Now, I think we're seeing something very similar between the West and China, which is, you know, it is not just the West that is dependent on China for cheap production of goods and for capital transfers in its purchases of US treasuries and agencies, which are other government-backed bonds, but also China's dependence on those for its own banking sector stability, and then also its dependence on the West as an export market for its goods. So, you know, the scenario that people often talk about are, oh, China could start an economic war by dumping its U.S. Treasury holdings, right. And you know, this is a weapon that, you know, the Russians never had. That is true. The Russians never had anything comparable. But something like that, I think, would be catastrophic for the Chinese economy as well. So I do think that we'll see much more of this, you know, mutually assured economic destruction aspect play out, and that will lead to even more intense competition on the periphery in the contested spaces, whether that be Africa, Latin America, or Europe. But as I said, the real lessons from the 2014 to 2022 period are how those kind of you know, developments can lead to tensions and lead to overall escalation. And because the stakes would be so much greater for both not just the United States, but the wider West, and for China itself from an all-out economic war, I hope that the lessons that both sides can learn are how to avoid that rather than how to fight most effectively.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I mean, like we had this, the US has running now I think a record deficit with China. So this discussion comes at a kind of interesting time, but I guess the probability of, let's say, something unexpected, let's say Taiwan, I mean, not so unexpected, the probabilities are not zero. And I think the discussions probably with decoupling or, you know, deglobalization that kind of affect this relationship are probably not zero either. So, okay. So you wrote a book. The book is Economic War, Ukraine and the Global Conflict between Russia and the West. So what are the major lessons that we can learn, maybe not from only the case studies from the book, but as a person, let's say, that has to make decisions, be it in a corporate environment, as a decision maker, and as an investor, what do you think are really kind of like the big kind of takeaways or the lessons that they, you know, can learn from your book? I think that's coming out like July, right? End of July 2020. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So, you know, I mean, one point that I would take away from it, which is both, you know, relevant to China in particular and businesses all around the world, is not only to see state action in terms of this geo-economic framework, but to plug one other book, I promise it's the last one, a recent book by Eric Helleiner, an American professor, US-based professor, titled Neo-Mercantilists, A Global Intellectual History, which his book is really about the history of neo-mercantilism, but I think the economic war is where we see it playing out today. And neo-mercantilism is, as he defines it, the belief in the need for strategic trade protectionism and other forms of government economic activism to promote the state's wealth and the state's power. And I think that businesses should really see government action through that lens, particularly on the international stage, for that way, you know, through that framework for the foreseeable future. I think that both the United States and China, as well as other countries, will continue down sort of this neo-mercantilist path, and in some ways, the recent economic war we've seen is proof of
industrial policy, right? Like you see this everywhere by now.
But the one, you know, other lesson that I would take away is that although China is a rising power and I think has this long-term strategy to supplant the US as the key of node in the international economic order, that's a 20, 30, or 40-year agenda, and how China continues to treat foreign businesses, how it deals with third countries that it is a large lender to, will have huge implications for that, and that it is certainly not preordained that China will be successful in its policy. And I think that one thing that businesses in particular should consider is that in some ways, even though we have this emergent bipolar world between the US and China, in terms of economic matters, the US has maybe not more hegemony, but more power and influence than it did even during the Cold War, right? So the example that I always give here is the recent CHIPS Act and Biden's executive orders, which has had such an impact on chip production in China over the last 6 months. During the Cold War, there's no action that the US Congress or the president could have taken that would have had a similar impact on, say, the Soviet nuclear or space industries. So I think that the power of U.S. sanctions and other forms of U.S. geo-economic policy is often underappreciated. And while I think there are signs that the U.S., in particular its domestic challenges, pose real threats to its long-term economic power, that at least in the short to medium term, it still has very, very significant ones, and ones that are unparalleled by any other country. Even Russia, which has at least as, if not a more advanced nuclear and space program in the United States, its GDP may be a fraction of it, but its control of global commodities is one of the largest and most significant states in that regard in the world, that even those tools, which are sort of the traditional tools of economic conflict between countries going back hundreds of years, are very weak in comparison to the tools that the United States has. One other lesson that I would just finish on is that, however, for the United States and for policymakers, overuse, misuse, and poorly thought out use of some of these tools that it has can engender backlash and speed the transition to a world in which China is more geo-economically dominant, in some ways faster than anything that Beijing can do. While we've seen huge Western unity behind the sanctions against Russia and a lot of the measures there, there are concerns that the Inflation Reduction Act and the US subsidies will cause competition with Europe, will push it away from the West. Europe moving out of the West camp and into the Chinese camp would be, I think, the biggest move China could take for potential success in its strategy.
That would be smart.
We're a long way from that, but I think it would be what they would need to turn it into from a strategy into one that I think is more than not likely to succeed. I think that the U.S. has to be wise and use the stick that it has more intelligently, and to repeat my point from earlier, also find the right time to offer carrots, not just sticks.
All right. Before your book is coming out in July, so a couple of months from now, where can people find you? Where can they follow your work?
Oh, certainly. Well, I'm also a fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, so they can look up FPRI and find my profile there. I'm very active on Twitter and tend to respond to any inquiries for debate there or messages. And it's Zakavkaza, which is at ZAKAVKAZA.
Okay. Maximilian, thank you so much.
Armin, thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure chatting.
Cheers.